This is Terry Wagar. This is a short vlog today for March 28th, 2015. The time is 1:03 p.m. The Multnomah County Sheriff's and the Portland Police Department I've already explained this on previous videos. They have taken over all the surrounding apartments surrounding this apartment. I am being harassed and terrorized by the Portland Police and by the Multnomah County Sheriffs and by their civilian operatives. The Portland Police Department and the Multnomah County Sheriffs have filled a multitude of apartments around here with civilian operatives, and they have which consists of essentially their buddies, their relatives, their girlfriends, and whatnot. And they have brought, they are filling many of these apartments, which all happen to be one-bedroom apartments. They're filling these one-bedroom apartments up with civilian operatives that have children, and they're directing and coaching these children to perform street theater performances, which is, you can compare it to a sting operation where these adult officers have quite literally trafficked children into this apartment area out here, and they're directing these children to perform street theater performances. Now, the children are being coached and directed to hang around near my apartment building area out in the courtyard. I'm up here on the second floor, and they're directing these children out there to run around and to make false pedophile accusations. And they're doing it over and over and over and over again. It's like take 1, take 2, take 3, take 4, take 5, take 6, take 7. It's sort of like that, where they're performing for video surveillance purposes out there, and they're repeating the same thing over and over again. I can only compare it to being ganged up on by a mob. Quite literally, it's an organized attack. The police department and the Multnomah County Sheriffs have the surrounding apartments. I can hear that the male officers that are in the apartment right next door, they were out here and deliberately and intentionally discussing this shit in between. These brats were literally given a break while these male officers were standing out here laughing about this shit and talking about this shit. And they went back inside, and starting at 1 in the afternoon, these brats have just started up again. They were doing this around between 11 in the morning and 12 in the afternoon, and then between 12 and 1, these brats were taking a break. And it was between 12 and 1 when these male officers were out here talking about this shit. They were deliberately and intentionally talking about it. And they're right next door to me. Right next door. They're not trying to hide it from me. They don't care if I know. Now, keep in mind, if you hear any brats out there yelling or screaming or anything, keep in mind that this entire building here and the entire building on the other side of the courtyard outside is one-bedroom apartments. No normal family with children would be living in these buildings. And yet they have filled these apartments. Literally, they have filled these apartments with a bunch of brats. And the majority of these brats that are out here doing this, performing for their street theater performances, don't technically even live here. They're just brought here by the Portland Police and by the county sheriffs. And then they're being coached. They're just coached and directed by the adult officers that brought them here to perform street theater performances, of which they repeat over and over again. And it's okay, one of the male officers just stepped outside. Okay. There's multiple male adults standing out here right now, right next to my apartment. There's at least 2 adult males standing out here. They're deliberately they're pretending they're smoking and this kind of shit, but they're not. If they were actually smokers, then this would be an everyday habit of theirs. But they're not smokers, and this is not an everyday habit of theirs at all. Now keep in mind, the date today is like, let's see, I think it's the 28th of March. I think that spring break just got over with. So they deliberately bring. Let me see what the date today is. The day today. I think it's a weekend. Yeah, it's a Saturday. Okay, it's on a Saturday. Keep in mind that these brats that are out there yelling and screaming and shit, they don't live here. This entire building is only a one-bedroom apartments. The building on the other side of the courtyard is also only one-bedroom apartments. Normal families would not be living here at all. These children that are out there yelling and screaming, they don't even live here. The Portland police and the Multnomah County sheriffs are paying their civilian buddies and their civilian relatives and their civilian girlfriends that have brats to perform street theater performances at this apartment, at these apartments, for the purpose of framing. And it is the Portland police and the Multnomah County sheriffs and their adult civilian buddies and relatives and girlfriends that are directing these brats they bring here to perform street theater skits Now, they were doing the same thing at the last apartment building that I lived at before I moved here. And I caught them on video and audio deliberately and intentionally hanging out in front of my apartment. And they were being coached and directed by the Portland police officer, Officer Eric Carlson, and by his partners and by his girlfriends. Now, and it was these officers and their girlfriends that brought the children there. Those children didn't live there either. And it was Officer Eric Carlson and the female adults that was in his company that were literally directing those children to make false accusations and to hang out in front of my apartment. And they were doing this repeatedly, and the entire time they were intentionally knocking at my door, and they were intentionally slapping my window screen because they were trying to get my attention. They wanted me to notice they were framing me, and they wanted me to notice that they brought their whore-ass girlfriends, brats, over to my apartment building to perform street theater performances to make me look like a bad guy. And they were doing this for their own video surveillance. Now, I can only compare this. The only way I can give you to compare this in a manner in which people that are unaware of these tactics, the only way to compare this in a scenario that people can understand or relate to would be to compare this to either a drug bust, sting operation, or a prostitution sting operation. Both of those type of sting operations, law enforcement takes over the surrounding area and fills the area with their operatives. And then they use street theater performances for the purpose of making their targets, the people that they're targeting, look like bad guys. And they do it out of their sheer performance. If a female cop dresses up like a prostitute and looks like a prostitute and acts like a fucking prostitute and then approaches you on the street and just starts talking to you, and you just try to ignore the person and you just try to continue on about your business, well, guess what? They have that on video now. So guess what? They can still make you look like a bad guy because they have you on video apparently talking to somebody that looks like a prostitute. Now, that is an example of a prostitution sting operation. Now, in a drug bust sting operation, a male cop can dress up like a drug dealer and act like a drug dealer, and then they can approach you near or around the area where you live, and then they'll start acting like they want to do a hand-to-hand exchange of some sort. Like they'll say, "Can you break a dollar? Can you break a dollar for me?" or something like that. And they do that kind of shit. And so guess what? Then they just now made you look like a bad guy. They made you look like a drug buyer because they're trying to trick you into doing a hand-to-hand exchange for their video surveillance. Both of those examples are sting operations. Both of those examples, law enforcement takes over and controls the surrounding area out of sheer numbers. And both of those operations, they're using street theater performances. Now, in this situation here, this is a situation where they're not trying to frame me as a John or as a drug buyer or some damn thing like that. This is a situation where they're trying to frame me as a pedophile. So what they're doing is they've taken over all the surrounding apartments surrounding mine. They've pretty much taken over full control of this entire building. Most of the people that they have in this building are their civilian operatives. The Portland Police Department is maintaining a constant vigilance on the apartment to my right, apartment to my left, and apartment directly below mine. So the very apartments that are right next to my apartment are the ones the Portland Police Department actually has their officers in, and they're armed. The rest of the apartments in this building here, for the most part, is their civilian operatives. Their civilian operatives consist of their buddies, their relatives, their girlfriends. Now, since they were trying to frame me as a pedophile, they are deliberately and intentionally bringing in their buddies and their relatives and their girlfriends that have brats. And then they just perform street theater performances for the purpose of framing. Now, they don't need me to step outside in order to make me look like a bad guy. They can make me look like a bad guy when I'm just sitting here in my apartment doing absolutely nothing, because of the fact that they were using Officer Eric Carlson as a photo double. And I found out about this in 2005, that they were using him as a double to frame me as a pedophile. And my wife, Joan Wager, was having an affair with that officer at the time, and I uncovered the fact they were using him as a double because my wife was hinting at it around her daughters, and I was picking up on these hints, and my wife was quite literally hooking our daughters up with this Officer Eric Carlson at Eastport Walmart when I discovered not only that they were using him as a double, but I discovered that it was open knowledge at Eastport Walmart by all the employees there that they were using him as a double. Now, I tried to warn people about this, knowing that my wife and her daughters were sleeping around with these fucking ass pedophile cops. And this, I knew damn well why my wife was hooking our daughters up with this cop, because this cop literally dyed his fucking hair blonde so that he could impersonate me, and they were trying to set me up. Now, they're generally being quiet right now because I'm basically talking right now, so the loud-ass sting-off that was going on when I just first started recording, they've settled down now because I'm not listening to them and not paying attention to them now, and they're aware of it because they have me under illegal video surveillance in my own home, and they know I'm not paying attention. They know I'm talking now, so they're being quiet and they're just letting me talk. Now, keep in mind that I uncovered the fact that they were setting me up as a pedophile and that they were using a double. Now, my wife poisoned me when I tried to warn people that they were using a double, and I was severely, severely debilitated. And my wife and her daughters and their fuck buddies in law enforcement kept me in a debilitated condition by repeatedly poisoning me, and the Portland Police Department was using their power of influence at the hospital to cover up the fact that they poisoned me. So I was quite literally debilitated and unable to get help. Think of the Stephen King movie Misery, where the star in that movie is debilitated and the person that's taking care of him is keeping him that way. Think about that. That's essentially what was essentially happening to me. My wife poisoned me, she debilitated me, and she kept me in that debilitated condition. Now, while I'm in that debilitated condition, my wife and her daughters continued to sleep around with these Portland cops, and they continued to stage and commit crimes for the purpose of framing, and were setting me up to get the blame for things. I have no idea all of the things that they were setting me up for, but I do know for a fact in March 26, 2007, Officer Eric Carlson and his partner, Officer John Ray, along with several of their female officers that are partners to them, along with some of their girlfriends, were quite literally setting me up for a homicide. And they were using Officer Eric Carlson as a double for that. And I uncovered the whole damn thing and quite literally caught them in the act, framing me for a homicide. I caught these people planting evidence in my home because they were setting me up as for a homicide. They were setting me up as a pedophile. They bragged about it at Clackamas Walmart. My wife, by 2007, my wife had already transferred from Eastport Walmart to Clackamas Walmart. So essentially, both of those stores, it was open knowledge. By 2007, it was open knowledge at Eastport Walmart and Clackamas Walmart because my wife worked in both stores. it was open knowledge of both stories that she was having an affair with Portland cop Officer Eric Carlson, and it was open knowledge that he was a look-alike, and it was open knowledge that he dyed his hair blonde so he could impersonate me, and it was open knowledge that they were setting me up as a pedophile by him acting as a double. And they all knew my wife poisoned me and had me debilitated. So this is why here in 2015 the Portland Police Department and the Multnomah County Sheriffs are investing a great deal of time, energy, money in setting me up, because they already publicly gave me the blame for a fucking homicide that Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray committed, and they're trying to cover their asses. They have no intention of having trials. If there is a trial, it will never be a public trial because of the fact that news media will say nothing about it. These people, they're quite literally using sting tactics to murder people. They're literally murdering people, and they're using sting tactics to get away with it. And apartment managers are going along with these type of operations and are aiding and abetting the police and the county sheriffs in the commission of these illegal crimes. It's illegal for the Portland Police Department and the Multnomah County Sheriff to take over the surrounding apartments for the purpose of putting their civilian operatives and their undercover cops into these apartments. That's illegal. You know why? Because they're trespassing. You know why? Because they don't live here. And these sting operatives are rounding up their buddies and their relatives and their girlfriends, brats, and they're trafficking these brats to this place, and these brats don't even live here. And then they're directing these brats to perform for street theater performances. So technically it's organized, they're guilty of organized crime, and they're guilty of trafficking and exploiting brats in their sting operations. And they're quite literally using their power, their police powers, to illegally take over the surrounding apartments in order to fill these apartments with their operatives. In other words, people that will lie for them. And they're using street theater performances for the purpose of staging crimes or setting up a crime, and for the purpose of framing and blaming their targets. And this is why they quite literally. If you think it's unheard of, you need to refresh your memory about sting operations. Start looking up sting operations, because of the fact, guess what? It's open knowledge that when police or county sheriffs have a prostitution sting, they'll take over an entire motel and fill an entire motel with their operatives. Guess what? Refresh your memory. In a drug-busting operation, law enforcement will take over an entire apartment building area and fill an entire apartment building with their operatives. So law enforcement are already publicly known to do that. Well, that's what they're doing in this situation, only it's not a drug busting. It's not a prostitution sting. It's simply these people several sting operatives got caught in a fucking homicide, and they got caught bragging to Clackamas Walmart employees that they were setting me up to get the blame and that my wife was helping them and everything. And they're literally caught in the act of doing that. So now they're trying to cover their asses, so the police and the county sheriffs are bringing in multiple sting operatives or sting operations for the purpose of taking full control of the entire area in which I live. Now, they don't go to this kind of trouble unless they intend on either killing their targets, or unless they intend on having some sort of a big propaganda push where they want to set me up to get the blame for their shit, and then they want to blow it out of proportion on the news media. They're not really hiding it from me. I already know that they've taken over the surrounding apartments. It's like they have me debilitated. I have no way to get help by calling for help. My 911 calls have been repeatedly covered up by the police department. My wife and her daughters were sleeping with these cops. My wife, Joan Wager's daughter, Megan Wager, got pregnant by Officer Eric Carlson's partner, David. So, and my wife at the time wasn't hiding her affair with Officer Eric Carlson. So my wife and her daughters were sleeping with these sting operatives. They had this whole thing planned out. They were going to set me up for a series of crimes, and they had no intention of giving me a trial. They just wanted to give me the blame for a bunch of shit, and then they were going to murder me off. Well, they're fully aware that I already have these motherfuckers on an audio recorder bragging in great detail to the homicide that they committed and how they were setting me up to get the blame. And I've secured that. So they have really no intention of having a big, giant, full-blown fucking trial. They just want to make their targets look like bad guys, and then they just murder their targets. Now, I am not their only victim. I'm simply the one dude that had the balls to stand up to them. But they have me debilitated, and they know it, and I'm quite literally surrounded by them. They have my daughter, Shauna Wager, helping them. She was filling my home with paraphernalia while the Portland Police and the County Sheriff are directing the brats that they traffic into this apartment building complex to perform for their illegal video surveillance. Now, keep in mind, their entire operation is illegal. When a female cop dresses up like a prostitute and pretends to be a prostitute for the purpose of framing the people she talks to on the streets, that's street theater performance. When a male cop dresses up and acts like a drug dealer for the purpose of making anybody he talks to on the streets look like a bad guy, well, guess what? That's a street theater performance. Well, in this particular sting operation, they've literally brought in their civilian buddies, their civilian relatives, their civilian girlfriends that have brats. And they're paying these brats to perform street theater performances, and it's the adult officers and the civilian operatives that are in charge of these brats, that are directing the brats in their performances. And it's a repeated performance because of the fact that, which is one of the signs that it's a sting operation, because they repeat the same thing over and over and over again. It's like, I can only compare how they repeat these performances to how they do movies in Hollywood, where they have take 1, take 2, take 3, take 4, take 5, take 6. Which is why it's a repeated performance, because they're trying to get what they do it multiple times because they're trying to get it just right. So they'll do this shit over. They do this shit over and over and over again. Now they're trying to provoke or some sort of a reaction out of me. They're trying to get me to fight back. Anything I do in response to what they do, they will record my reaction to what they do, and they will simply not tell anybody that I am defending myself, and they will simply use my reaction as their claim of mental illness. So if I try to fight back, they'll act like I have no reason to even be angry or upset. And why are you acting like this? You crazy? See, that's how they'll act. And see, that's why they try to provoke their targets. Now, if I actually fought back with violence against these sting operatives, well, then they would just outright shoot me, and then they would claim justification. Now, because of this is why they just constantly provoke and harass. Imagine being surrounded by bullies that are packing weapons, and they have you encircled
and you're all alone, and they're hitting you, and they're pushing you, and they're shoving you. They shove you into, one bully shoves you right into another bully, and then that bully shoves you back, and then you're just being picked on and shoved. And the moment you lift a finger to defend yourself, that's the moment they pull out their weapons, and then they just open fire, and then they claim justification because you attacked. And then they refuse to admit, and they refuse to tell people that they were attacking you. And that's how they get away with it. So it's like they don't record their harassment, or they don't use video of their harassment where they're harassing and terrorizing me. The only video they would show the public is me fighting back. And they would use that as their claim of justification in shooting. Now that I've explained this, keep in mind this is very similar to what the KKK used to do back in the 1920s. These organized people gang up on their targets, they surround their targets, and they terrorize and harass and provoke their targets, and the moment their targets fight back, that's when they usually pull out their gun or whatever, and they usually end up shooting their target. Back in the 1920s, when the KKK did this shit to people, they usually did it for the purpose of hanging. If there were, in the 1920s, if there were black people and even some white people that the KKK hated and they wanted gone, what the KKK did back in the 1920s was they would rape or murder the white person, and then the KKK would give some black person they wanted gone to blame, and then they would publicly hang that black person without a trial. And how did the KKK back in the 1920s get away with it? Why? They vilified, they're organized, and they vilify the living shit out of their targets. And because they take the time to vilify, and because they're organized, so they vilify in an organized manner, they appear in the minds of the ignorant masses to be credible as witnesses. It's like, well, gee, there's several people saying this person committed this crime, so it must be true. Well, that's why the KKK always got away with it, because they're organized. They all agree to lie for one another. They gang up on their targets, and they'll give false blame on their targets, and they do it in an organized fashion. Keep in mind that in the 1920s, it was pretty much the KKK that was running the streets. The KKK was being phased out when all over the United States of America they started started creating police departments. Well, where do you think all those KKK people that were running the streets, where do you think they all went to when they started creating police departments? In 1890, there was no police departments anywhere in the United States of America. There were no police departments, but the KKK was fucking everywhere. And your goddamn news media and your history classes in schools try to hide that back from people. The KKK was phased out when they started creating police departments all over the United States of America, and that's essentially the KKK hung up their robes and their hoods and their lynch ropes, and in exchange for uniforms that have badges and billy clubs and guns. So quite literally, the KKK transformed in the 1920s and the 1930s into your police departments all over America. And it's the same people that ran the KKK that run your police departments. The same fucking people. They're the people that run the streets. They're the people that are organized. They're the people that gang up on people. They're the people that will stage crimes for the purpose of making their targets look like bad guys. Now think about it. If police and or county sheriffs take over an entire apartment building and fill that apartment building with their operatives, that means for the purpose of staging and faking crimes, well then guess what? They can easily frame anybody for anything. And they do it easily. If police and county sheriffs are willing to take over entire apartment buildings and for the purpose of drug busting operations, and then they pay officers to act like and dress like drug dealers for the purpose of framing and entrapping innocent people on the streets, well, that means law enforcement is prepared to literally do anything. They'll break any law. They'll commit any crime for the purpose of giving blame to their targets by association. Now, they have, quite literally, the Portland Police and County Sheriffs have full control of this entire apartment building and all of pretty much this entire area at Misty Firs Apartments. And they can quite literally stage and or commit any crime they want to, and they are committing crimes, quite literally. They're committing crimes. The fact that they're out there directing these brats to perform for their illegal street theater performances, that's illegal organized crime in and of itself. They're trafficking and exploiting minors. They're corrupting minors in their sting operation. These brats are obviously going along with this shit, so obviously they are brats that belong to people either in law enforcement or people that are connected to law enforcement, such as people that are buddies to authorities or people that are relatives to authorities or people that are girlfriends to authorities. Now, I know for a fact that the apartment manager is aiding and abetting these sting operatives in these crimes. She is literally guilty as an accessory to their crimes. She's allowing the Portland Police and the Multnomah County Sheriffs to illegally take over the apartments here at Misty Firs Apartments for the purpose of them staging and committing illegal activity and illegal crimes. And technically, every single one of these sting operatives that are here don't live here. Just because the police department and the county sheriffs are renting the apartments doesn't change the fact every operative they put in these apartments is a trespasser. And the reason why is because they're not a tenant. And the reason why is because they don't live here. They have legal address elsewhere. They're just brought in here. They're brought here for the purpose of their sting. Well, guess what? That means they're not legally tenants and they don't live here. Only tenants can live here. If sting operatives cannot live here, they cannot use this property. They cannot use the property where people live and are entitled to rights and are entitled to the protection of the law. They cannot legally take over the surrounding apartments for the purposes of staging and committing crimes. Now, they're quite literally breaking a multitude of laws. They are, like I said, this entire building is one-bedroom apartments. The building on the other side of the courtyard, that is all one-bedroom apartments. And yet these sting operatives have peppered both of these damn apartment buildings with their civilian operatives that have brats. Now that's more than enough to identify. That's more than enough to identify them as sting operatives. A normal family would not live in these apartment buildings. A normal family that has brats would not be living in these apartment buildings at all. So quite literally, the apartment manager is permitting the Portland Police Department and the Multnomah County Sheriffs to fill a multitude of these apartments, not with tenants, but with sting operatives that have brats. So they're quite literally trafficking and exploiting brats that they bring into this fucking area and are placing these brats into these one-bedroom apartments. And the apartment manager is aiding and abetting them in this. Technically, she is just as guilty of their crimes as they are themselves. This is illegal. Now, just because, it's like being ganged up on by the KKK, because they're organized, and they've already repeatedly covered up my 911 calls. These same sting operatives that have taken over the majority of the apartments here at Misty Firs apartments is the same sting operatives that had full control over the area at Subi's Bar and Grill, which is about a mile that way. Not even a mile, probably about 10 blocks down the street. And there was 5 people that was shot. One person was killed. And it was sting operatives that committed that crime. And it was these same sting operatives that had full control of that area when they committed that crime. And they're trying to hide the fact from people that news media majorly tries to hide the fact that police are using sting tactics to commit murders and to frame people. They try to hide it from people. Apartment managers don't want people to know that they readily allow the police and the county sheriff to take over a multitude of apartments for the purposes of their operations. All sting operations are covert in nature, and which means they try to hide it. And news media goes along with this shit, just like apartment managers goes along with it, and their mums the word about it to people. They don't tell people about it. They don't want people to know they're doing this shit. Now, in my situation, I'm not some big important person here for them to go to all this trouble. They're not going to all this trouble because I'm some sort of an important person. They're going to all this trouble because they themselves committed a shit ton of homicides, and they were sleeping around with women that were involved in those homicides, that were connected to the people that were being murdered. And they all got caught by me on an audio recorder bragging in detail the crimes they were committing. And I secured that audio recording. So, me, myself, I'm not some sort of an important person by any measure of the word. I'm most definitely not... they're not going to all this trouble because I'm some sort of an important person. They're going to all this trouble because they all got caught in a homicide. Or at the very least, several of their sting operatives got caught in a homicide. And they're caught admitting they were setting me up to get the blame. And they were sleeping around with my wife and daughters at the time. And they were bragging in detail how they were setting me up and about the crimes, and they were bragging in detail about the crimes they committed. And they were doing this bragging at Clackamas Walmart. They're quite literally guilty of murder, and they publicly gave me the blame. So they can't really hide the fact that they did that. They literally, Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray, along with several of their female poor-ass sting operatives, they committed a break-in and they committed a homicide. And they were laughing and bragging about it at Clackamas Walmart. And Officer Eric Carlson was having an affair with my wife, Joan Wager. And it was my wife, Joan Wager, and some black bitch by the name of Adrian that is also in law enforcement, that is connected to Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray. It's these two women that took over the printers at Clackamas Walmart, and were printing the flyers using Walmart equipment and supplies, they were the ones that were printing the flyers giving me the blame. So my wife and Officer Eric Carlson's fuck buddy was the one printing the flyers giving me the blame. And I have them all on an audio recorder, bragging in detail what they did, how they did it, who was involved, and how they were setting me up to get the blame. And I even have them on the audio recording, printing the flyers, giving me the blame. So they can't really hide, not in a big, giant official trial anyway, they can't hide the fact. They already blamed me for a homicide that they committed. So they're in a sense, they want their bullshit allegations they pressed on me to stick. So now, instead of being surrounded by just several sting operatives and being targeted by several sting operatives, I'm targeted by a couple dozen sting operatives. And the reason is because they're trying to cover their asses. And it's not unheard of for the Portland Police or the Multnomah County Sheriff to take over an entire motel for their sting operations, or to take over an entire apartment building for their sting operations. As a matter of fact, when it comes to prostitution stings and drug bust stings, police and county sheriffs are already known to take over entire motels and or take over entire apartment areas for their sting operations. So they're already known to do that. Now, in this particular case, this is not a sting operation where they're just trying to net whoever they communicate with. This is a sting operation where they're trying to set me up and make me look like a bad guy, because they already set me up for a homicide in 2007 and publicly publicly gave me the blame for it. Now, there was never a trial, there was never an official arrest or anything like that, because what they did was they poisoned me. They had no intention then of having a trial. They just wanted to publicly vilify me and to give me the blame, and then they were going to murder me off. My wife and her daughters were sleeping with these sting operatives. So it was very personal on their part to frame me. Now, they are aware of the fact that I have secured evidence of their guilt. They have no intention of permitting me to warn people. If I send emails over the internet, they auto-delete my emails. If I make comments online, they auto-delete my comments. So I have no way to communicate really with the outside world and to tell people that I'm a victim of a sting operation, or to warn people about the crimes that these people committed. I'm being routed through some sort of an FBI server or something like that. I don't know exactly how they do it. I'm not computer savvy when it comes to how do you put it? The tactics that law enforcement use. But I'm not necessarily a noob at computers either. I know how to format a hard drive and reinstall an operating system. I know how to install security software and whatnot. And like if I just got a normal virus on my computer, I wouldn't even give a shit. I would just format the hard drive, reinstall the operating system, and then reinstall my programs that I know are safe. But I have no way to keep the government from hacking my computer, and they have hacked my computer repeatedly. I already know they have this computer hacked, but they're not necessarily preventing me from using it. Instead, they're not even necessarily affecting the computer's ability to operate. So they haven't necessarily damaged it necessarily. What they've done is they've simply have me hooked up to some sort of a special server where any attempt on my part to go out on the World Wide Web to communicate with anybody, instead of going through normal ISP servers, I'm being routed through some sort of FBI server, and they are simply auto-deleting any and every comment and any and every email I send. Now, if I make no mention of these crimes whatsoever, like in an email or on a comment, like for instance, like a YouTube comment as an example, those comments won't be deleted. But if I make any mention of my wife Joan Wager's affair with a Portland cop and name the Portland cop and make any mention of the crimes that they were setting me up for, those comments and those emails are auto-deleted. So I have to assume that I'm being routed through some sort of a police or county sheriff or FBI server. Now, I suspect it's FBI, and the reason I suspect the FBI is responsible for that is because I already know the FBI were involved. Mid-2006, my wife, Joan Wager, was bragging while I was in a severely debilitated condition. And this is about 6 months before Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray and their harassed female partners in law enforcement and their harassed girlfriends, Joan Wager being one of them. That's when they committed a homicide. So about 6 months before Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray committed a homicide with the intent of framing me for it, I was in a severely debilitated condition and bedridden and couldn't get out of bed, and it was during this time when my wife, I couldn't even talk. That's how badly poisoned they had me. This is when my wife was flaunting the fact that the FBI joined into it. Now, I already knew my wife and her daughters were sleeping around with local authorities and that this was personal and that they were setting me up as a pedo and that they were using Officer Eric Carlson as a double. I already knew all this. Well, in around late June, early July is around the time that my wife was literally admitting in my presence that the FBI joined into it. Now, these people are guilty of murders. These people are guilty of murders. My wife has already confessed to her affair with Officer Eric Carlson. When my wife had me debilitated, by poisoning me, and she and her daughters were sleeping with these cops, while I'm in this debilitated condition, my wife spent about 2 weeks writing in that diary. And this diary is essentially her response to me reporting at the hospital that my wife, Joan Wager, is a poisoner. And she's admitting in that diary, that diary is essentially her response. And she's basically spent 2 weeks writing that diary. And there's about 50 pages, around 50 pages in it. And the entire, from beginning to end, everything that's in her diary was from March 2006. And she's admitting that she's a poisoner. She's admitting I'm accusing her of being a poisoner. She's admitting I couldn't get help from the police or from the hospital. She's admitting to her affair with Officer Eric Carlson. She's admitting she wanted life insurance money. She's naming off the poison she used. She's admitting I was trying to come up with money to pay for a toxicology test because I knew the bitch poisoned me, and I'm accusing her of being a poisoner, and she's admitting that I'm accusing her of being a poisoner. Well, she's also admitting that she's a plasma donor. She's also admitting that she's a liar and a psycho. She'll say one thing in the diary, and then the very next day she contradicts herself. So she's not even keeping track of the lies she was telling me. The whole purpose of her writing that diary was as a rebuttal to me accusing her, and she's essentially just flaunting her guilt and doesn't give a shit if I know. And she even admitted in her diary she wanted me to read it. She actually gave me her diary to read, and she's admitting to that in her diary. So she's admitting in her diary she surrendered it to me, which means I have legal possession of it. Now, at the end of her diary, she's quite literally admitting she's poisoning a plasma donor. And I called 911 to report it. And my wife, while I'm on the phone with 911 operator, my wife battered me. And when her buck buddies in the Portland Police Department responded to my 911 call, they assaulted me. Nobody took my complaint. Nobody took me to a hospital. Nobody helped me. So my wife essentially is admitting in her diary she's a serial killer, she's a poisoner of a donor. And I called 911 when she admitted. My wife battered me while I'm on the phone with 911. The Portland Police responded to my 911 call, ignored the fact that I'm the 911 caller, and assaulted me. They even saw me on the phone with 911. They saw me speaking to the 911 operator, and they heard me talking to the 911 operator before I hung up to talk to the police, and that's when they assaulted me. So she's not hiding her affair. She's not hiding her guilt. She's actually flaunting it in there. Every time she makes mention of Officer Eric Carlson in that diary, she makes mention of the Portland Police. Each and every time. She is constantly contradicting her own self in that diary. One day she'll say she's being honest, the next day she's saying she's a liar and a psycho. So that should give you an idea of how she was flaunting it. And keep in mind, she specifically wanted me to read that diary. She's specifically giving me permission to read her diary, which means she legally surrendered it to me, and I haven't surrendered it back. Now, my wife's daughter, Megan Wager, at the time Joan Wager wrote this diary, my wife Joan Wager's daughter, Megan Wager, was pregnant by Officer Eric Carlson's partner, David. So my wife and her daughters are whores and sting ops for the Portland Police and for the Multnomah County Sheriffs. Now, this was written by her in March of 2006, and I'm already debilitated and was trying to find help. Well, by late June, early July of 2006, Joan Wager was flaunting the fact that the FBI joined into it. She was whispering under her breath, admitting that I'm fucked now because the FBI joined into it. And she wanted me specifically to know. She had me in a debilitated condition. I already knew my wife's fuck buddies in law enforcement gave her permission to poison me. I already knew they were using Portland cops as doubles to set me up. So my wife was essentially flaunting the fact by mid-2006 that the FBI joined into it. So I have every reason, because I've already documented on a previous vlog that when I make comments online, and I've already made a video documenting the fact that when I make comments online, they get auto-deleted. If I make any mention of my wife, and her affairs with Officer Eric Carlson and with other cops, and make mention of the crimes that they're guilty of, those comments get auto-deleted. Now, if I make comments that have nothing to do with what these sting operatives are guilty of, then those comments are permitted. So I'm under the belief that the FBI is